Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Sister District Indivisible. Thank you for putting this on and reading the book, and I'm so grateful for the reception and the readership and the audience, and it's wonderful. And thank you for all the work you do and for that beloved community. I love Sister District. I love Indivisible. I am so grateful for all of the chapters across the country. You are making a huge difference this year. This is such a crucial year, all the way down ballot, all the way around the country. And we can talk about and discuss some of the reasons why. Let me apologize at the beginning for the 1972 wallpaper behind me. We are at the beach. I hope it's not too distracting. So we are away. This is not my actual wallpaper. I'm looking so enviously at all of your bookcase backgrounds. Ordinarily, I have a nice bookcase background. And tonight I look like I'm coming to you live from my grandmother's house on Zoom. Anyway, this book really began the quest for hope. I had written a book on partisan gerrymandering with the memorable title of Rat Fucked, which first exposed the highly effective Republican strategy called Red Map in 2010 to win state legislatures in competitive states like Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and elsewhere, just ahead of redistricting, kind of like the year we're in right now, and then to use this powerful new map-making software and data sets that have become available to redraw not only state legislatures and congressional districts, but really to hotwire our democracy itself. Now, let me assure you, no one sets out to write a book about partisan gerrymandering, but Red Map, this had come as news to me. Like you said, I was editor of Salon, I was editing Steve Kornacki and Joan Walsh every day, but we didn't write about gerrymandering. The New York Times, Washington Post, Red Map was not something that was in the news that people were aware of, but every day we were covering what seemed like absolute madness in the US House, the body that John Adams designed, right, to be a perfect replica of the people in miniature. That people's house instead voted to repeal Obamacare more than 50 times, each one of them a show vote with no possibility of passing. And then as a Connecticut native with a newborn child, I watched kindergartners and first graders massacred at Sandy Hook and thought, surely, despite the political power of the gun lobby, the senseless slaughter of 6-year-olds must lead to some action designed to prevent this from ever happening to any American town. Again, it did not. So I asked what seemed to me to be a simple question. Why didn't the Democrats take back the US House in 2012 when President Obama was reelected, when Democrats retook the Senate? It turns out Democrats won more than 1.4 million more votes than Republican candidates in that year. Republicans kept a 234-201 majority. Now, we don't elect much of anything in this country, let alone Congress, based on the popular vote, right? But this was unusual. This was historic. That kind of disconnect didn't usually happen. The Obamacare votes, the refusal to act after Sandy Hook, the vitriol in our politics, none of this was a mistake. None of this was by accident. It wasn't the Russians that did this to us. The Republicans did. Red Map. That's what it created. We live in Red Map Nation, the anti-majoritarian country that gerrymandering helped build. It's one of the most important reasons why our politics has become so extreme, so dysfunctional. It's one of the reasons why Americans are in the street right now demanding social justice during a pandemic, because we know that voting in this broken system is no longer enough. There are right now 59 million Americans, that's 1 in 5 of us, who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. Let me add to that there are 59 million Americans living in states in which Democrats won more votes in the 2018 election, and they do not control any of those state legislatures. So this toxic combination of gerrymandering, closely followed by voter suppression laws passed by these unaccountable legislatures had tied our democracy into this profoundly depressing double knot of unfairness, and it had established nearly unbeatable minority rule in otherwise competitive states. It just wasn't easy to see a solution for this anti-democratic crisis that had contributed so dramatically to the extremism, to the polarization, to the hopelessness that plague our politics. I'd give talks about the book, and I would feel like I had this dark rain cloud over my head, like I was in the Peanuts comic. You can understand why I needed some optimism. And I saw a Facebook post by a young Michigan woman named Katie Fahey. And Katie has an amazing story. It's election night of 2016, and she's 27 years old. She's working at a recycling nonprofit in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she gets a magic ticket for the Hillary Clinton victory party in New York City. She hops a plane. She puts on her finest red pantsuit. She heads to New York City. The night does not go as Katie planned. When she is home, back in Grand Rapids on Thursday morning, getting ready to go to work, she's already thinking ahead to Thanksgiving 2016, the Hillary, the Sanders, the Trump supporters in her family, the mashed potatoes that were going to be flying through the air. And she takes to social media and she writes, "I would like to take on gerrymandering in Michigan. If you're interested in doing this as well, let me know." Maybe it connected because of the smiley face emoji that Fahey added next, or maybe it connected because gerrymandering had severed the connection between politicians and the ballot box in Michigan. But that single post by a regular citizen, it pioneered a winning redistricting revolution in a state where no one thought it could happen. They marshaled more than 4,000 volunteers who went out and collected 430,000 signatures. They raised more than $14 million. It was the first time citizens got an initiative on this ballot in Michigan without having to go out and hire paid help. And they won at the polls in November of 2018 with 62% of the vote. It wasn't that long after that I spoke at an event with Desmond Meade, who had taken on the difficult task of returning voting rights to almost 1.7 million people in Florida who had a felony conviction in their past, who essentially had lost their civic voice forever because of that conviction, even after they'd served their time. It was a cruel vestige of the Jim Crow South that ensnared 10% of all adults in Florida, nearly 25% of the adult Black population in Florida. Let me tell you, Desmond Meade has this inner glow, and he knew that pain so well because he had been one of those silent citizens. Drug addiction and deep depression had led to a felony weapons charge. One afternoon after his release, homeless, still struggling with drugs, he stands before the railway tracks outside Miami, and he steels himself to jump in front of the next train, but the train doesn't come that afternoon. It's almost something out of a movie, right? He walks across the tracks instead, guided by some kind of higher power. He finds himself outside a drug treatment center. He checks himself in, he turns his life around, returns to college, he earns a law degree. What he wanted was his right to vote. That was the one thing in Florida he could never get back. So Desmond Meade becomes the executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Committee. He builds this mighty coalition that unites Black and white, Democrats and Republicans, ex-cons and second chance believing churchgoers, tattooed Trump-loving deplorables and radical criminal justice reformers into this moral movement that's funded by both the Koch brothers and the ACLU. And on election day 2018, even as Florida elects a Republican governor, a Republican US senator, 64% of the state backs this constitutional amendment to restore voting rights. They voted for fairness. So I was pretty certain that we did not need another book about how democracy dies. So I set out to join these quiet revolutionaries who were reinvigorating our civic fabric at the very time we needed it most. And I watched as these regular citizens demolished barriers that the experts said were too stout, too high, too imposing. I joined these voters, not politicians, canvassers in Michigan as they door-knocked tens of thousands of homes. We canvassed across Utah and Missouri where activists won critical reform in red states. I watched Native Americans across the Red Rock Desert in Utah and the tribal lands of North Dakota mount these desperate, heroic pushes to determine their street addresses and make themselves tribal IDs to preserve their voice against surgically focused voter ID bills, intricate precinct closures, and gerrymandered chicanery. I rode the Medicaid Express, a rickety green RV across Idaho with these gutsy millennial activists who didn't understand why their legislature wouldn't accept their own tax dollars back from the federal government to ensure 70,000 of their neighbors had health insurance and wouldn't accept no for an answer. In Alabama, where the state legislature, under court order, finally returned voting rights denied to tens of thousands of citizens released from prison, but refused to allocate a dime to actually help them register to vote, we went door to door, bus station to barbershop, with concerned citizens determined to add their neighbors back onto the voting rolls. They won. They won big. They won everywhere. It's a new American revolution in many ways. It's a demand for fairness. It's the insistence that our voice is our vote, that our leaders are temporary, but the people rule, that we have no task more important than preserving this democracy and the hard-won fight to participate in it. It's about ensuring that our votes count, that our elections are meaningful, that our votes translate equitably into seats, that a majority of Americans standing together win the right to create their own future. Our hard work, our collective fight can fix it. These citizens became the change they wanted to see at a time when the news cycle, right, it feeds this never-ending sense of exhaustion. It was so inspiring, let me tell you, to ride alongside those who turned off cable news, they got off of Twitter, and like you all, they got to work. The promise of this nation, it endures because we all believe that somewhere embedded at the heart of this experiment in self-rule is the ability to fix what is broken. We know what is broken. We know who broke it. We're not about to let them keep breaking it, not behind closed doors, not without raising a ruckus. Idaho's Medicaid expansion initiative began after 2 recent graduates from a high school in the northernmost notch of the state. They're now studying medicine. They're working on history books, but they realized that they had organizing skills that might help a much needed school levy in their hometown overcome bitter, well-funded conservative opposition. They won. That victory made them hungry for more. When they settled on healthcare as an issue, they painted that 40-year-old RV. They called it the Medicaid Express. They crusaded to every corner of the state collecting signatures. It's a party, it's a Republican one-party state. It's redder than Taylor Swift's lipstick, but they captured 61% of the vote the old-fashioned way, persuading their neighbors this was the right thing to do. We were in Idaho Falls, a 90-degree day in August. We walked up a driveway. There's a truck in the parking lot, and there's a bumper sticker on this truck, and it says, Vietnam. We were winning when I left. And I look at this truck, and I'm thinking, maybe we should go to a house over here. They were winning in Vietnam when this guy was there. He doesn't want to talk to a bunch of lefties talking about Obamacare. And they knocked on his door. They didn't notice that. He opens the door. They start talking to him. The man starts nodding his head, and he's like, my family falls into that gap. I'm going to vote for that. It was a really, really powerful moment. North Dakota is a powerful story as well. It's a state that has such clean elections, they don't even require voter registration there. But in 2013, perhaps not entirely coincidentally, right after a Democrat, Heidi Heitkamp, wins a US Senate seat with the help from the largest minority voting bloc in North Dakota, Native Americans, legislators decided to pass a voter ID bill that demanded a street address. They demanded, yes, the one thing that did not exist on tribal land. The tribes knocked it back in court. The legislature kept coming back, refining the law. Finally, just days before Election Day 2018, a judge okays it. And so the tribes, they got to work. Professors worked out geomapping coordinates. Volunteers purchased machines and created so many new IDs, they burned them out. The law had directly affected and threatened the right of these Native Americans to vote. On election day, they turned out in massive record numbers to protect it. Turnout surges. The legislator who wrote the original voter ID bill, he loses his race for re-election. He loses to a woman named Ruth Buffalo, the first Native American woman ever elected to the state house from North Dakota. These efforts, none of them were led by parties or by politicians. They all began with regular people. While the coastal media, right, they camp out in Midwestern diners and, pretending to bust out of coastal bubbles, searching for heartland white male wisdom, this new national activism emerges. Everyday citizens wondering how they can contribute, finding answers right in their hometown. None of these battles were easy. Many of these initiatives were challenged in court. They needed to overcome legal claims and multi-million-dollar negative ad campaigns funded by dark money masters and powerful special interests equally determined to defend their status and influence. But the battle had been engaged, a torch had been lit, and citizens set off sprinting. When state legislatures, when local election boards created complicated new voter ID requirements or closed precincts, even in rural areas, they suddenly met organized howls of resistance, whether in rural Georgia or rustic Kansas, New Hampshire college towns, or those Native American lands in Utah and North Dakota. And then those local legislators, long protected by their friendly district lines that discourage good challengers and make it hard for anyone else to raise the money necessary to oppose them, they had to run for their lives. As a new generation of data-savvy activists train newcomers and young people how to seek office themselves, down ballot where it can matter most, aided by all of you in Sister District and Indivisible. You all know none of this is easy, that the forces of reform that are lined up against us, they don't quit. We've seen the news from Florida about how politicians there have helped gut the amendment returning voting rights to those with a felony conviction. We see the headlines every day, right? As the president manufactures lies about mail-in voting, deceitful tweets that are themselves a form of voter suppression, in an effort to sow doubts about the legitimacy of this fall's election. We see it every day as Tennessee makes it harder to register to vote during a pandemic, when Oklahoma requires a notary for an absentee ballot, when Texas refuses to accept the pandemic as an excuse to vote absentee, when Wisconsin forces voters to the polls in person, makes them choose between their health and their right to vote, when Republicans in Pennsylvania sue to try to stop drop boxes, when the post office slows just ahead of a crucial vote by mail election, when the census is cut short by a month, when the Supreme Court provides the legal enforcement muscle for a voting rights wrecking crew. Frederick Douglass said it best: power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has, never will. The history of voting rights, though, it's one of expansion and retraction. It's not a straight line forward. Our current fight really is the latest chapter in the struggle over the vote that is as old as the nation itself. We might like to pretend that our nation's story is one of ever-expanding suffrage, with courts protecting and defending this crucial fundamental freedom, but it's never been as simple as that. This struggle did not end with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or with the 19th Amendment, or with the Voting Rights Act, or certainly with the resounding passages of all of these democracy reforms on Election Day 2018. The work that remains will only get more difficult, but that's to be expected. Our frayed democracy, far more fragile than we imagined, will not be healed with any single election. Progress must not be measured by any individual win, but by the number of battles and people engaged. Keeping a democracy, it turns out, requires a lot of work. But what I think all of these stories, they all have in common, is that they show when regular citizens unite and fight for the kind of democracy that they want. When we put our hands on Martin Luther King's long moral arc of the universe and pull in the direction we want it to go, There isn't a structural barrier that can't buckle. I want to leave you with my favorite story from the book, from Alabama, and the night that a woman we met named Sherry lost her voting rights forever. And it began like any other teenage evening in rural 90s Alabama. High school friends and a classmate's ride, a drive-through run, dinner outside, perhaps someone passing around marijuana, and the sound of a police car and a couple of white officers wondering what that herbal odor might be. There were cops who might have looked the other way, right? Or maybe let those kids off with a warning. Perhaps in Tonier suburbs that night, this very incident goes the same way and ends differently for other kids. But that evening for Sherry, it ended with drug possession charges for everyone. In the eyes of the state, they were no longer high school seniors, they were felons. And in Alabama, felons guilty of a crime involving moral turpitude, such as this minor possession charge, an offense so small it would not even be a crime in many states, they forfeited their right to vote forever. Sherry was 17. She'd never voted. Now she never would. Her most important right as a citizen erased before she'd had the ability to use it. I had no idea. She told me we weren't thinking about voting at all. But these were laws from the Jim Crow era that reached back and they ensnared her. They were not consigned to history. Finally, 160 years late, Alabama's legislature ends moral turpitude for all but the most serious crimes. Except, like we talked about, the state was determined to keep that news as quiet as possible. They wouldn't update the forms, let alone notify people that they could vote again or instruct parole officers to help. So these citizens started going door to door and bus stop to bus stop in search of folks who needed help. It's how I met her outside the Birmingham bus station just after 6 a.m. this summer morning. When we approached, we asked if she was registered to vote. She kind of waves us away, embarrassed, uneager to respond, right? And no one wants to admit a felony conviction to somebody on their way to work, let alone a middle-aged white guy walking up to you at the bus station in Alabama. We simply say, hey, we're out, we're informing people about a change in the law, that a felony conviction no longer costs you your right to vote permanently. And her eyes, they grow wide. And she's like, I have a conviction. We hand her the clipboard with the list of serious crimes, and we say, if it's not one of these, we can sign you up to vote right now. And she's like, it was just possession. We were 17, we were stupid. I can vote. We hand her the forms, we walk her through it. It takes a couple of minutes. We give her back a voice that she never thought she would have. We were all in tears by the end of this. It was unbelievable. And to me, this is what this is all about. We are all fighting for Sherry, for people like Sherry. This nation has been built, it's been improved by people, whether it's the women walking for suffrage or John Lewis and the marchers across Selma's Pettus Bridge. Progress has been long, progress has been hard, progress has been of our own making. Days before John Lewis's death just last month, he asked to visit the new Black Lives Matter plaza in Washington, just blocks from the White House. Frail and with a cane and wearing a 1619 cap to commemorate the year Blacks were first brought to America as slaves, he took in the scene from a nearby rooftop, then walked to the street below, rejoicing in those giant yellow letters. Then in that powerful essay, I hope you all got to read in the New York Times, published posthumously, he wrote about that final trip and how inspired he was to see the power of citizens once more, these young people demanding their voice, running for office, courageously speaking truth to power. Democracy is not a state, it is an act, he wrote. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. This is our work as citizens. It's understanding democracy as an action, as a verb, something that must be tended, something within ourselves we must work to protect and perfect every day. The life of John Lewis shows that this capacity for perseverance, for courage, lies within us all. The struggles ongoing at his death show us that we have a long way to go. We know our democracy is broken. We know it's been broken actively and intentionally by forces who choose to ignore the will of the people rather than to commit themselves to listen to every voice in a dynamic and ever-changing nation. But that torch, it's lit. There are citizens who have never before joined a protest, who've taken to streets and circulated petitions and stepped forward to run for office, launched new organizations and joined movements that reimagined what democracy might mean. They dreamed a different future, ignored those who said the work would be too hard, sworn their efforts are as irrelevant, or warned that the odds of victory seem far too uncertain for such a heavy lift. And then they devoted long hours and came together by the thousands in RVs, in courtrooms, in bus stations, at the doors on frigid winter mornings, and they made those dreams real at the ballot box. Yes, the threats to democracy are real. We don't know yet whether the usual peaceful transfer of power that we have so blithely assumed will occur should the president lose this next election. This year has laid bare the anti-majoritarianism within our system, the inequities of the Electoral College, the rural biases of the US Senate. It has shown us how fragile our institutions, the census, the postal service, the media, the justice system can be, and how unprepared we are for the unimaginable when it happens here. But the lesson of Katie Fahey, of Desmond Meade, of these marchers for social justice, of volunteers everywhere is that we do not need superheroes. We do not need the perfect presidential candidate to save us. That these battles on behalf of what's right, led by millennials, by former felons, by suburban women, by Americans of all ages and races who refuse to believe that the act of creating change was beyond them, are the proof, I think, that there is a mighty unrigging underway. And I hope that these stories leave you with the same rebirth and sense of optimism and hope and possibility that they did for me. Thank you.